Thanks very much, John. Thanks for the invitation. Just a brief introduction. I'm Julian Galt. I'm the Deputy CEO of the Southern Institute of Technology in the southern part of New Zealand. In fact, it's very nice to be in Melbourne here today because it's a very nice respite from the winter in the very south of the South Island. My colleague, been a partner on this project, Dr. Stewart Hase. At the time that we worked on this, he was our research manager, and Stewart has had a long and distinguished career in tertiary education, predominantly in Australia. So thank you for this opportunity for us to talk about our experience with a knowledge and records management project. I realise that there are some inherent risks with, in effect, my parachuting into Melbourne for a day from offshore and being perceived as saying, well, this is how we fix something and you should do likewise. But in that context, we did have a real problem. We worked our way through it and we learned quite a lot along the way, and particularly about change management. So for sharing some of that learning is of help to you and provide some direction or perhaps a point of reference for you or something that you're working on, then we hope the effort will have been worthwhile. So we're focusing on the learning, not too much about the organisation, and we're certainly not going to take any sort of a didactic approach. And for anyone who's feeling a bit sceptical about a presenter from the very south of the Shaky Isles, my colleague is almost a local from New South Wales, and he is a significant part in what follows. Now, given the subject matter here, and the nature of the session I'm about to contribute to, my anxiety level, which is actually quite significant, or rather my concern is probably very much along the lines of what Material Girl Madonna's latest love interest must have been thinking on their first night together, and that is to say, I know what I have to do. I'm quite keen, really. I'm just damned if I know how I'm going to make this interesting. So the focus of the presentation, as you can see from the slide, is on the learning in particular. The details of what we've done here is based upon two papers that we've published, and those we've made available to you if you're interested after the conference. So the context, I'm going to make you feel very much better about your own situation. No one could be in the shape we were in at the start of 2007. And this photograph and the one that follows shows very vividly the state of records and knowledge management in our organisation at that time, and these are just a couple of examples of where we were at. This is the basement area of our downtown campus in the central city. It wasn't previously a jail, it was actually a bank vault. But the story gets worse. If you pan the camera 180 degrees to the right, the view would be the same. So what this is really a photograph of is neglect and perhaps negligence. And we had some worries about it. Even without the prospect of an audit of our systems, we had some real concerns. Accountability was difficult. Everyone was working to local systems. It was impossible to achieve consistency of operations, and every available storage area was crammed full. Risks were pretty obvious. There was embarrassment to be asked for any records, and when we were, they were difficult or impossible to locate, and we would be going back to a long-serving staff member who might know quite a lot. And looking back, it's amazing how bad the situation got before any action was taken. Now there's a paradox, because despite all of this, the organisation had done extremely well, with exceptional growth in numbers of students, which is something quite difficult to achieve in provincial New Zealand in tertiary education. And that success was due to innovation, obviously in other areas, and an entrepreneurial approach to the business. So clearly the product market strategies said in 2000 had been working, but these were not matched by the records and knowledge management strategies which date back to the earliest years of the organisation, the 1970s. The next slide perhaps speaks for itself. And it did occur was that knowledge management, records management is a bit like SafeSec. It has to be right, there may well be consequences if it's not. So what I believe we were caught up in was the perils of the paradigm, the way we're thinking about the organisation, about the way the culture of the organisation worked. In our culture at that time, anything to do with managing records was an add-on. It was considered unimportant. It wasn't a priority. It wasn't given emphasis within objectives, budgets, and even within the consideration of likely risks. And managers filter their view of the internal and external environment through the paradigm of the culture, as illustrated here. The culture has a very powerful effect on how we see our world, and there was a real risk of myopia, and it sure was in our case. So for me, the model very clearly explains why something that should be self-evident is often disregarded, perhaps explains why industries once strong fade away, are radically altered or downsized. In the past, the British motorcycle industry, perhaps quite recently the finance and lending industry in New Zealand, and some of those guys are being sent to jail at present. Stewart.
As a psychologist, what I'm going to talk about now is unashamedly psychology. To a hammer, everything looks like a nail. To a psychologist, I guess everything looks like a behavioural problem. But my take on this project, like many of its ilk, it really is fundamentally about change. One of my observations as an organisational consultant and as a clinical psychologist has been that change is enormously difficult. And what surprises me is that even though we know a great deal about how to more effectively manage organisational change, most organisations do it very, very poorly. And one of the reasons they do it poorly is that they don't incorporate it as part of the strategy. It's kind of, when change fails, we better do something about it. So it's kind of an add-on done later. Change management for me needs to be incorporated as a part of your planning right from the beginning. In other words, we need to anticipate that change will be difficult. That's the wrong way. And change is difficult. As a therapist, I've often found that people who are in great pain and who wanted to change found it difficult. And I've also found that people who don't want to change find not changing even easier. And you may have found that too. And it is extremely difficult. And there are also good reasons for that, which I won't go into in any detail unless you want to catch me a little later, and we can talk about the anatomy of resistance. But it's a natural human trait for us to resist change. We like predictability. These are some of the reasons why change initiatives fail. And if you take each one of those, in my view, what we need to do at the beginning of a change management project, such as implementing a new record system and a knowledge management system, we need to have a plan and a strategy for each one of these. Now, all these points are taken from extant change management models, like Cotter, Pusner and Kozner, and Blanchard and Miller. They're right out there. We know how to make change happen, and try to make. So we need to have a strategy for each one of these. So this is a kind of a hybrid of some of the models. So we need to have a strategy for each one of these. We also need to consider an analysis of organisation. I've just chosen 4 here, but they might be things like you might have lots of internal inertia, you might not. I'm working for a company tomorrow doing a consulting exercise in Brisbane where there's no internal inertia at all. They're a very enthusiastic bunch of people, but inertia might be something. Cultural norms, what is the culture like? We need to take into consideration people's priorities, and also how passive and active resistance is managed within our organisation. In the case of the institution that we work with, they had a sound business model. It's very entrepreneurial and very effective. It was a dispersed and diverse organisation with wide-ranging focus. It was very successful, but its knowledge management processes were very poor. And we chose an action learning approach to this project. And if you're a researcher, you'll be making an action research approach. For review, and as you'll see later, one of the things we learned is that this is an ongoing project. The other thing that's important is to make sure that your change management processes are in line with the literature on knowledge management. We know a lot about, or supposedly know a lot about, how to implement knowledge management processes within organisations. There's a vast literature. And I've synthesised 5 main factors that seem to occur quite commonly in the literature about that. About developing awareness, articulation of benefits, which can be quite a challenge, determination of strategies, developing internal factors, and then implement. And there's quite a, like I said, quite an extensive literature on how to actually do this. What's interesting is that organisations often don't look at it. We get to sing a duet in a minute.
Okay, well, from all of the above, you can see we had quite a lot to motivate us in 2007. And the key external driver that came on the scene at that time was new legislation about public records compliance and with audit consequences. And it took that to get some traction in the organisation. There had been an understanding that improved records and knowledge management systems would be a benefit if only we could figure out how to get this done. And on the numerous perceived benefits like consistency, avoidance of duplication and so on, risk reduction was perceived as paramount. The fact that senior management was closely involved and had a high level of ownership was one of our key critical success factors. We didn't have the time or the resources in-house to get the project established ourselves, and so a consultant became a key element in making the records management processes change. And of the work done, the charter, the policies, the taxonomy that was drawn up, the roadmap that emerged from all of that was what was most valuable to us. And we established a records management position which hadn't existed previously, and that role provided what was needed to enable us to successfully follow that roadmap. So in terms of outcomes, we now have, several years on, improved systems and processes that are of benefit to the organisation's operations. And although we still have qualms when people ask for records from long ago, as recently as 2 weeks back, someone from the Ministry of Education asked me for a record from 1980, and that was provided in full within 2 days. So there is now a clear understanding across the organisation of what is needed to ensure ongoing progress. And we have, to this point, and it's only to this point, been most fortunate that the dated and inadequate systems in use have not led to a litigious situation. Could have done. It's been good luck, not good management, and the legacy still haunts us because there's a lot of stuff we still can't find. It's going to take years to actually work out of the problem. That's the storage area the following year, 2008. It took 3 shipping containers to clear that area alone. Records were forwarded to a storage contractor, where they now reside in logical, searchable order, and the safety and security, you won't believe this, of Christchurch, where they have been restored several times since. So it just goes to show, risk mitigation is always relative, never perfect.
So finally, what do we learn from this rather large change management project with a significant number of staff across a number of campuses? The first thing is that and you'll find this in the literature also, that knowledge management is strategic. Now obviously it needs to be the right strategy. It needs to be a component of, it's often neglected, and it needs to be a component of everyday activities. It must be aligned with the business strategy, and it must be seen as an enabling factor. And knowledge management and records management are reciprocal, indistinguishable. Knowledge management and record management must be a component of the operating cycle and understood and owned by all involved. And case organisation focus was and still is training and mentoring in the systems required to achieve the organisation's purpose. So it needs to be seen as a strategic initiative and considered with all of it in your strategic planning cycles throughout. In most organisations, it's an add-on. It's maybe something that HR does or some other part of the organisation. It doesn't have a strategic imperative. It's not just another task. It has to be core. A core competency and not just an add-on. And it's about central to maintaining institutional memory, and I'm sure you've had that message driven home over the last couple of days. There must be a high level of integrity and lots of myriad processes to sustain it. The thing about knowledge management is that there are lots of side effects for it if you do it properly. Arnold Palmer, the golfer, most of you familiar with Arnold Palmer? Any golfers here, apart from me? Arnold Palmer once said that the more I practice, the luckier I get. I have been doing a lot of work in oil rigs in the last couple of years, which has been quite interesting with Bass Strait. They're interesting places to go, particularly for a psychologist. There's lots of books to be written if I had time in my life to write them. But one of the interesting things that some of the oil companies have found, not all of them, but some of them have found, that is if they get people to plan work well so that it's undertaken safely, then the work becomes more efficient. There are side effects. And it's the same thing with knowledge management. We found that at our institution that factors included reducing risk, credibility was increased, we were able to control costs, there's a potential for innovation, customer service levels improved, and ensuring the continuity of organisational knowledge. Now, turnover in this particular organisation, because Invercargill is such a wonderful place to live in summer, which is why I live in New South Wales, it's a wonderful place to live. The turnover is not very, very high, but in organisations where turnover is high, and I'm not sure quite what it's like in local government, in our local government on the north coast of New South Wales, people tend to stay there, they don't tend to move on because it's such a lovely place to live. But in organisations where there is a high turnover, knowledge management becomes critical, or at least losing knowledge from the organisation. So there are lots of benefits or side effects. This is one of my favourite change management issues, and it's one I rant on about quite frequently. Change needs to be driven, a knowledge management process like this, we learn, needs to be driven from the top. When I get invited sometimes to do change management projects in organisations, one of the things that I do quite purposefully now, I didn't do it when I was younger, I guess I was hungrier then, and now that I'm quite old, it doesn't matter so much, and I'm on a pension, it doesn't really matter. I'd rather go fishing instead. But these days, I go and have a conversation with either the CEO or the most senior person that's involved with the project. And the single thing that I want to know, and it's not what they say, it's what they do, because what people say is not necessarily what they do, and I tend not to believe what most people tell me. That's what happens when you're a psychologist. Is I want to know whether they're committed. Because they often go, yes, I am really committed to this change initiative. Yes, absolutely. Because if they're not committed, I'm going to get white-anted. And if they're not committed, I don't take the work. And I don't care how much they will pay. It's just not worth it and it won't work. So it needs to be driven from the top down, and there's total commitment and buy-in from senior management. And of course, everybody else in the organisation sees this, white anchors get dealt with, and away we go. And we need to build from the bottom to encourage ownership and accountability. And what this means is that I think senior management needs to say, this is what we want. And then the people, the workers, the people at the coalface, the people who know how to do their jobs, what their role is to work out how to do it. I sometimes get amazed at CEOs that say to me, well, this thing just fell apart, it didn't happen, things went wrong, you know, they're not really committed, the union's got in the way, and this happened and that happened, or whatever. And I say, well, what kind of consultation processes did you have? Well, we got everybody into the cafeteria on a Friday afternoon and we told them what we decided and asked for any feedback over the weekend. And they consider that to be consultation. This has probably happened to you in the past. And they consider that to be consultation. So driving from the top, building from the bottom is an absolute key management strategy. You've got to trust people, that the people at the coalface know how to do things. There's quite a famous study undertaken by White and Sutcliffe. One of the things they wanted to know was, where can we find a really dangerous organisation that works well? And they chose aircraft carriers. And they went and studied what happens on aircraft carriers. And on the deck of an aircraft carrier, you've got planes coming in on a moving target. They're full of fuel. They've got bombs all over them. And the deck has got bombs and stuff all that everywhere. And they manage to land most of the time pretty safely. And one of the things that they saw that was absolutely critical was that on an aircraft carrier, expertise outranks rank. And that is a remarkable concept. And it's one that a lot of organisations don't understand. So driving from the top, building from the bottom, letting the people work out how they do things, and obviously working with them to do that. So that's one of the things we learned from this project. And there's a high level of involvement by staff at all levels. One of the things that organisations sometimes do badly too, and it was alluded to in the last presentation, is that providing training and support. Some of the quite interesting change management initiatives that I've seen have failed because people weren't given the right amount of training and then get blamed because they weren't complying with whatever was happening. So it's train first before, or as part of your strategy, and train first, get people up to speed, develop capacity, and then implement the change. And obviously one of the things that happens with a lot of organisations is that there's such a rush to get things done, to suddenly change it, even though things haven't been great for 40 years, that we've got to do it tomorrow or next week because of some compliance problem, or because something got into the newspaper. I guess that was critical to local government, at least it is in our area, and that suddenly galvanises interest. You have to take the time and make sure that people you've got the capacity before you actually create change. And in knowledge management, that can be quite difficult because it's such a kind of obscure concept. You know, knowledge management is not something that's kind of really concrete that you can get across very quickly. And the other thing we've discovered is that it's ongoing, and that's why action learning approach was very useful, because you can just keep on going through action learning cycles. And so even though it's robust, it's never over. It's not over until it's over, and it's not over. And as Julian said, there's still a long way to go. But even if you have been successful with developing knowledge management, it's, again, at a strategic level, it needs to continue. So it's an ongoing process, not one that ever stops. The other thing that was critical to this project, it may not be in your organisation, but that's getting expert help. Now, I'm deeply suspicious of gurus of all types and all persuasions, and I'm deeply suspicious of myself, because I try to pretend to be a guru like I am being now. So deeply suspicious, but expert help is absolutely critical here. How many, well, rhetorical question, lots of organisations implement change management projects like knowledge management, and yet don't really understand what it is that they're doing. And some organisations are really reluctant to hire somebody in who can actually help out, somebody who's an expert, somebody who knows exactly how to do this. Now, whether that's because of embarrassment or cost or whatever, but I can tell you it can be extremely expensive if you try to do something that you don't know how. So actually involving an expert in this project was critical. And then developing the expertise within the organisation. If you hire somebody who's an expert and they're not prepared to teach everybody else within the organisation, you've hired the wrong person.